So thanks everyone for joining. This is the second edition or the second episode of our webinar series. And my name is Vijay. I'm a Senior Vice President here at Environics Research. And I'm joined with Michele, my colleague. And today we're going to be talking about generations and value differences within generations, across generations, also value similarities between generations. But the reason that I wanted this to be kind of our next topic is because I think generations are one of those things that there's a lot of generalizations made around, millennials do this, or Gen Z does this, or this is how millennials think, or why millennials have ruined blank. And I know as a millennial, I don't love seeing those articles, but I think it really misses the nuance that exists kind of in the world and really takes away almost from the humanity of people. And so I think values and the way that we think about values here at Environics within the context of a generation or with kind of a generational segment gives us a lot more nuance into who people are and allows us to expand the way that we think about different generations. And so I want to take some time to introduce Michele. Michele, maybe you can just give a quick introduction of who you are, what group you work for, and the type of work that you do and how you might use values in your day-to-day work.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Michele Cunningham. So I work on the market strategy team here at Environics Research. Our team really works across a wide variety of sectors and industries and verticals. And we work with a lot of different clients who are really interested in better understanding their audiences. And so we work with them to help make those connections and to better connect more deeply with their audiences, whether it be consumers, stakeholders, the public, their employees, other interest groups. And we do that with a values lens. And so a lot of market research, as you may know, being familiar with market research, we're researching people's behaviors or people's opinions on things or people's attitudes towards things or people's behaviors. And what values allows us to do is peel back those layers of the onion and go one level deeper to understand the whys. So why do people think in this way, or why do people behave in certain ways? And it really helps us to just better understand how we can deepen those relationships and create more meaningful connections so that our clients are better able to resonate and speak with a wider group of audiences.
Great. So both Michele and I are millennials, but we fall into two different segments. And so on the screen, you're going to see that we have divided our segments or our generational segments into kind of five major ones. So elders, boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. As you see, as we go along the continuum, there's more kind of existing segments within the generation. We'll talk about why that is, but maybe Michele, do you want to give folks a look into who you are, which segment you fall into, the millennials, and talk about like when you found out that was your segment, what you thought, and how it reflects kind of your lived experience.
Yeah. So we have a quiz which we're going to be sharing with everybody at the end of the session that'll help you identify what segment you are within your generational cohort. But before I took that quiz, I had a hypothesis as to what segment I was going to be based on what my values are and where I ended up. And I was actually quite surprised with the results. So my segment is the new traditionalist segment. And so this segment, as the name might suggest, tends to hold more traditional views or more conservative views, stronger connection with traditional structures like religion, government, those types of authority groups, communities, things like that. And so it was interesting because I did grow up with a religious background. I don't like necessarily practice now, but I feel like my upbringing really helped shape and form the kind of values I have. So a value that's prominent in this group is propriety. So the way you dress or the way you act or present yourself in front of other groups. Again, having religious or religious faith. But the interesting point about this segment is that they do believe these things, but they have more progressive thinking as well. So while there's a high propensity for people to be on that spiritual quest or to find a community they belong with, it has to be genuine to them. And I think that's really, that's what stood out to me was, yes, I may have grown up going to church every Sunday. But as I've grown up, I have these more progressive views, and I'm more open to different things. And so I found it's an interesting. What about you? What segment are you?
So I fall into the diverse strivers group, and I think you make an interesting point just in terms of like when we think about values and how our values are formed, they're formed from a very young age. And so your experience going to church regularly, my experience being a child of immigrants has really influenced the values that I hold. And so diverse strivers, there's a lot of kind of around pursuit of intensity. There's a lot around like kind of status and security. And so those things I know kind of where they come from. And I think because we think about values a lot as, you know, two people who work here, I reflect a lot on my values individually. I think the general public doesn't really think about their values on a regular basis. But so we have the, I guess, benefit of kind of having that ability to kind of step back and think about what's actually influencing our values. But I think it's really interesting because neither the new traditionalists nor the diverse strivers really fall into what I would call like the stereotype of the millennial. And so I think that's also why maybe it bothers me as like when I see these articles making kind of broad assumptions, because I think it really does, it doesn't allow us to actually see like the nuance that exists kind of within each of these kind of generational segments. And I think, you know, there was some great comments in the chat at the beginning, but when we think about like, okay, why is this important? I like to bring up, you know, two men that, you know, may demographically and, you know, life experience wise look very similar, but from a values perspective are look very different. So you have King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne, both male, both born the same year, both raised in the UK, both married twice, they both live in castles, they both are wealthy and famous. Yet, like when you think of them and you think about who they are and what kind of drives them and what motivates them and what their values are, they couldn't be any different or any more different, right? And so it's important to kind of understand that when we think about like millennials or Gen Z, we want to develop a strategy for millennials or Gen Z, or we're thinking about things from a demographic perspective, we're actually missing a lot of really like interesting nuance and like more authentic connect, because I think the way that I would connect with King Charles is going to be very different than the way I would think about connecting with Ozzy Osbourne.
Exactly. And I think we get a lot of requests. We have a Gen Z strategy, or we want to connect more with millennials. And that's great from a perspective, but understanding why are these your targets? What do you want to learn about them? But also taking a step back and thinking, if we're speaking to these groups with the same messages and we're trying to resonate with everybody, we're really not resonating with anyone. So our generational cohort segments actually help us to understand, okay, what is our message and how can we position that message or that service or that product to
doing it in a way that, and I think one of the benefits of all the technologies and things that we have is that you can do a lot more targeted kind of messaging. It doesn't have to be this mass message anymore. You can be a lot more specific. And so thinking about the ways that we can nuance messages, that's going to kind of find a broader audience to connect with. And I think you see this, like, you know, governments are often really challenged by this as well, because they're trying to reach a really broad audience, but a broad message doesn't work, right? When you're speaking, when you're trying to speak to everyone, you're really speaking to no one type thing. And I think that's important to kind of to think about. You know, Michele, you work a lot with values and specifically kind of Gen Z and millennials and things like that. But maybe can you talk about some of the trends or you know, values that you see that maybe even are a bit counterintuitive or go against kind of the grain?
Okay. So I mean, starting off first with like my segment and my own understanding of my own segment. Just because someone might seem to have more or hold some more conservative or traditional values doesn't necessarily mean that they're not open to other things or diverse points of view or diverse perspectives. And so I think that's one thing that we've been seeing is that there is a lot of nuance in value systems. And so you can be open to social learning and learning from others and open to new ideas. You're not necessarily closed off. The other one that we mentioned, we've seen it a few times. We measure a number of values that are related to one's financial position or how they approach their life as a consumer, whether they're a little bit more spendthrift or they think more consciously about what they're spending on things, or someone who's more of an impulse buyer, or someone who's more concerned about their future financial security. And what we found is just because somebody has high financial concern for the future doesn't necessarily mean they're unwilling to spend. So we've had lots of segments come through and lots of different audiences that have this propensity to be a little bit more reserved and more concerned about what their future is going to look like. And of course, with the way things are right now in the world, like there is a general sense of concern, but they're willing to buy on impulse. They're willing to spend more money on premium products and premium goods and luxury goods if they align with their values and with their interests. And so it's understanding all of the different values as a whole really helps us to be able to connect more deeply, position products or services or messages in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. And I think, I work a lot in the healthcare space. I think, we think about the physician-patient relationship and how that's changing. And that really is changing as a result of values that are being driven by the patient, right? Like that kind of sense of individuality, that sense of kind of that less kind of trusting of authority figures, less trusting of institutions, that kind of thing, that all plays into the way that people kind of engage and interact with the system. And so thinking about that, we also have opportunities to be thinking about kind of how we plan for the future using a baseline of values to kind of build our strategy on. And I think there are obviously differences within segment or within kind of generations, but there also are a lot of similarities between generations. And I think sometimes we think about things in the context of like this is a product or something that millennials would like, but we don't think that there's like a boomer segment that actually might also like that. Think about the opportunities that kind of creates for you to kind of connect with new folks, to bring new people into the mix, to kind of bring people along as you're thinking. I think about a lot like climate change or kind of coalition building. You need to come to not everyone cares about climate change for the same reasons. The values that drive the kind of the kind of like the intensity in which someone pays attention to it, or the priority in which they kind of put it, we need to put it in the context of their life and their values. And I think it's important. So maybe looking at Gen Z and millennials, I think sometimes people are like they're completely different or they're the same. What does our data kind of say?
So Gen Z and millennials, that's one of the biggest myths is we see it everywhere. Social media, there's a lot of divisiveness between Gen Z and millennials these days. Side parts, middle parts, ankle socks, crew socks, what have you. And so what we've actually found through studying values is that these groups are the same but different. So yes, they share a lot of similar values, but they also have very different values. So when you look at the shared values, they hold values that we find younger generations typically hold. So more of a penchant for risk, like doing risky things or seeking stimulus. But they're also really more aligned on this whole idea of novelty and having new experiences and experiencing different things every day. They're also aligned when it comes to brand genuineness. So aligning themselves with values that are similar to their own, or with companies or products or brands or services or organizations who have a story and a meaning and a purpose. But then when we look at the different sides of the spectrum, we see millennials tend to have higher levels of time stress. So they tend to experience a little bit more of that feeling around time stress. but they place higher value on importance of brand and the need for status recognition. On the flip side, with Gen Z, they're a little bit more individualistic in their values. They're really active in their community and with their government, but they have a high sense of wanting to like learn from others and adapt to others, or learn from other cultures and different things, which is likely a result of social media and the internet and technology they've been brought up with for their life. It's allowed them to connect with so many different worlds and different communities from the very beginning. And so we do see that there are differences, but there are similarities as well.
And I think your comment on technology is really important, because we live in a world where technology changes so quickly, but the influence of technology on our values is significant. And we see that in terms of like, when we look at the millennial segments, there's 6 unique segments. And you think about when millennials were kind of the age, or what we kind of consider millennials, is 1980 to 1995. That's 15 years. But within those 15 years, there was so much that kind of changed. And depending on when you were born, whether you're born like in the 1980 or you're born in 1994, your experience with technology is quite different. And so that we see that reflected in the diversity of the values that we see kind of within the millennial segments. So I guess, Michele, like, we have a bunch of folks that are on the line that are kind of interested in understanding, like, how do we actually use this? Like, I think theoretically talking about values can be really interesting, and it's good conversation, but like, how do you actually use this within your organization?
Right. So it's a great question. So we use values in a variety of different ways in different applications, and we really work to help understand the needs. What do you need to know? One application, of course, is through segmentation. So our generational cohort segmentations provide that opportunity to organizations who may be new to research or maybe not have huge budgets or huge timelines, access the segmentation to better understand who their target audiences are. So that's one way. We also can embed them into custom segmentation. So taking a client's custom segmentation that may be driven by behaviors and attitudes, and layering social values to help them get more out of it. So taking those behaviors and understanding more about the whys. We use social values in customer journey work as well, and not just necessarily customer journey work. I feel like that's such a broad term. There's so many different journeys. There's a journey to post-secondary education. So we've worked in that space. There's a journey to voting. So how do you get someone to actually get to the voting phase? There's a journey to vaccination. There's so many different journeys. There's career journeys. And so we layer a values perspective into these journeys in the various stages to help understand what's motivating us through and what's pushing us through these stages. What are barriers, and why can our values help explain what those barriers are? And what are some of those messages that our audiences need to hear to get them across the different stages and to help get them to the end of the journey? So values is a really excellent application in that format as well. We've also used social values in concept testing or new product development or service development or message testing. And again, it can help us better understand why did this communication flop, or why did this ad flop, or what is it about this message that is really resonating. If we look at social values, we can understand and help optimize those messages.
Yeah, I think the concept test and like creative testing is really interesting, because we always, if you actually break out like the positives and the negatives, or like the verbatims that people say, and you link it back, you can like start to really picture like, oh, I understand why this person really loved this, or why this person really didn't like this, and kind of what's driving that. And I think your point on kind of integrating it with other elements like behavioral or attitudinal segments, I always talk about kind of values being this universal way of thinking about people. And because it's so kind of long lasting, like our values don't change from year to year, but our behaviors can actually change year to year, because if new products come to the market, if there's new technologies, if new governments kind of come in. Like there's all of these things that can really influence behavior, but it's really about by kind of grounding yourself in values, you have something that's a bit more long term. And so thinking about the future becomes a little less kind of shaky because you feel like you're on kind of steadier ground. And I think that like when working with clients and thinking about, okay, what is going to be the result of, as Gen Z starts to have young families, what's the result of how they're going to parent their families? How are they going to parent their young children? Like, what are they going to do? And I think what that gives us is an opportunity to think 5 years ahead instead of like just 1 year ahead, and be ideating and thinking about what new innovations do we need to bring to the world that's going to kind of create more kind of ease and allow people to kind of feel more included. Because I think when we start to just, again, stereotype and group people, it really turns people off. Like you see it in the way that people kind of react to things. And I think that's really kind of an important kind of consideration in terms of like, why do you base things kind of in values? You were talking to me the other day about the travel example, and I asked you to bring that to the conversation because I think it's just an interesting way of thinking about, I think travel's a good one because everyone has their own travel preferences, but like maybe talk us through a bit about what looking at the different kind of segments within a generation might do to kind of your strategy or your plans.
Yeah. Okay. So the example provided, these are two Gen Z segments. One is egalitarian idealist. The other is hustling hedonist. And when we look at their values, it can help us really understand how might they approach a new summer event or something that's going on this summer. So when we look at egalitarian idealists, they really want to discover new and authentic places. They want to find a place where they can express their creativity, flex their creative skills. But when we look at their values, they prefer more smaller scale. So more authentic experiences, things that feel genuine and align with their interests. In terms of barriers, they're skeptical of big businesses and skeptical of advertising and don't trust it. So having a big splashy ad campaign to promote a big popular destination might not work with this group. So this group might be better off served. They're also very cost conscious, and so they think more consciously about where they're spending their money and where they're spending their time. So something that might work with this group might be a more smaller, intimate gathering or a private event, or something that one of their close, trusted friends has said, hey, we should go check this out. On the other hand, if we look at our hustling hedonists, these folks are all about searching for that viral experience. They want the trendy. They want to have something that has the cachet that they can brag about or post about or get that perfect Instagram shot. With this group, they'll try anything once. I think that's the critical thing. They are really driven by novelty seeking, new experiences, stimulus seeking, and so they get bored quickly. So this group may not necessarily be the audience that you want to invest in growing over the long term, becoming a regular client of yours. But you can leverage them to influence others. And so I think, again, this is just 2 of 7 segments, but it does show you how different people within this one generation might approach a new event. Or something.
And I think, there's a lot of, talk around influencers and how do you use influencers and, and not just for kind of commercial purposes, but also from like a government public health perspective. Like, I think about that a lot, but sometimes it's not necessarily like the number of followers this person has, but more like the authenticity of the message that they're kind of delivering and the way that they're delivering, the reasons behind why they're delivering the message. And people really pick up on that. And you see that like in the way that people engage online. They're trying to find people that kind of think like them and have values like them. And as organizations, if we're thinking about things too broadly, we're missing that opportunity to connect in a really meaningful and kind of authentic way.
Yeah, it's true. We did do a study recently, and we found a very high proportion of Canadians want to align themselves with brands, companies, organizations that share the same values as them. And this is even higher amongst the younger generations as well. So it's like in the upwards of the 90s, like 90% want this. And so being able to understand your audience and what their values are, and maybe it's not your core audience, maybe it's the audience you want to grow with. It really does help you to better connect and more meaningfully.
And also think about like what the implications are of doing something. Like, how is your audience going to react, so that you're prepared to kind of come back to them with something that is actually meaningful to them and that actually aligns. Because we all know that it's harder to gain someone new than it is to kind of keep someone that you already have. And so thinking about your audience and the values that they have, and how do you make sure that everything that you're doing kind of aligns to their values and what they're expecting from an organization.
Exactly. So maybe this campaign that you've had isn't going to resonate with this one group, but how can we tweak the message or change the message or talk about something else that might resonate in a way that aligns with their values?
Or talk about it within the context of an experience that would be more unique to kind of the egalitarian idealists that you talked about, wanting kind of more smaller, more curated types of local like events versus like those large scale events. Are there ways of kind of intersecting with those things that are a bit more natural to individuals based on what we understand of their values?
Yeah, exactly.
So I do know that we want to leave some time for questions. So if you do have questions about the generations, about values, please put them in the chat, and we'll look for those. We're also going to share at the end a QR code that will allow you to go to our website where you can find out what your social value segment is. It's always a good way of kind of, if you're trying to get your colleagues interested in values, pass it along to them. They can, it's a really interesting discussion. I get people to do this at dinner parties sometimes. And it's a party trick. And so having a sense of like kind of who people are and having people discuss like, oh yeah, that I never really thought about that, because again, we don't think about our values on a regular basis, but or it's so innate to who we are as people that we don't wake up and say, today I'm going to have this value, or today I'm going to have that value. It's who we are. But when you really start to kind of think about it, then you're like, oh, I kind of get why I did this. So, and we have another stereotype that's really that Gen X and Millennials are having the same experience. That is something that we hear a lot from folks, and that the experiences that they have are like, because values are different often, the way that they are having that experience is different. And so like, it's really important to kind of think about how are people taking in what you're serving up in terms of like messaging or whatever it may be. I think vaccines, we talked a bit about this, but like from a public health standpoint, it wasn't so much that there was like anti-vaxxers and people who believed in vaccines, but people were getting vaccines for different reasons. Some people were doing it because they wanted to just get back to social life, like that kind of social learning, and all of that was really important. Some people were doing it to kind of protect others. Others weren't getting it because they, didn't really understand it, or they like they don't trust government. Like there was many different reasons, and by like the media headlines, I think they grab attention, and so it's easy to kind of plot people in this one or another. And I think what I like about values is that it adds color. It adds so much color to kind of the way that we think and the way that I like view the world in general. So I'm just gonna see, are there any questions kind of coming up? Are there any questions, Michele, that you get from clients a lot?
Yeah, and we've had a number of requests lately in the post-secondary education space. So understanding how to better engage with students. And so we know anyone can go to any university, or any post-secondary institution, college, what have you. And so we've been working with some organizations to help them better understand the student experience, but through the context of these social value segments. So how might an engaged idealist want to engage with a post-secondary education? How do they make their choices about that? What's important to them? How can we foster some more satisfaction out of that group versus what's the experience going to be like for, say, a diverse driver?
Right.
And so helping understand what the motivations are, how to talk to them, what's important to them really helps organizations better understand how to make those connections and work to make that experience more rewarding for everyone. Because we know, especially in the first year, it can be a real challenge. Right. Like it's so helping people move along the path with ease is where values come into play.
Someone just asked, how do you think the introduction of the internet and importance of online activity has impacted values across the generations? Interesting. So from my perspective, I think that the internet has actually in some ways siloed us more to be more like in our echo chambers of values. And so as a result of that, there's an assumption that people share the same values as us. The people that we interact with online have similar values to us often. And so, you know, I often, not to go into politics, but I often think about like my timeline during the 2016 election, like Hillary Clinton should have won every single vote, right? Like it was, I kind of live in a bubble, and it's important to kind of push back against some of those things. And I think when we think about the internet and how it's kind of influenced our values, I think in a lot of ways, it's also made, like it's opened up doors, and, you know, people who are open to new experiences or crave that kind of new experience or new perspective, it's given voice or given an opportunity where, you know, that may not happen especially if you grew up in a small town or something. You know, I think values around kind of like the importance of diversity, like that kind of thing, those have kind of been influenced. We've seen changes kind of over time.
I mean, when you just look at the generational cohorts themselves and how the number of segments has changed. Right. So you're going to the pre-boomer segment, we had 3 segments identified. And now when we're looking at Gen Z, we have 7. And so it has opened the doors, and it has allowed people to have different ways of thinking and different.
And I think the way that people use the internet is also influenced by their values. So what are they seeking on the internet? Are they seeking, like, you know, small communities and like kind of on unique platforms like Discord, right? Like the person who's using Discord is very different than the person who's using Facebook, right? Like those are 2 very different people, and they're driven. That behavior is often driven by their values. And so I think internet and technology has a huge impact on values kind of across generations. And I think we're going to see, particularly in like Gen Alpha, as we start to kind of track that, like how many different segments we're going to find, but also like because a lot of the technology that we have is not necessarily new. Like we've had now cell phones for quite a long time. They've become kind of a standard. What does that mean in terms of like value around connection, around family, around like how people think about family even, right? Like how people think about, you know, a lot of people talk about like chosen family, that kind of traditional family versus non-traditional family. Like those are values that are really kind of driven by the experience and what people are exposed to. And so people are exposed to a lot more things. And so they're going to find niches and areas that kind of really resonate with them.
Maybe I know I tend to lean into, just from the kind of work we do, talking about values from a consumer standpoint, and how we can target different consumer groups. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how we use values in like public space.
So in the public space, I think it is definitely a lot more challenging because you are trying to reach everyone, right? Like within a consumer market, you're okay with kind of, this is my target market, this is who I'm trying to reach and understand. And so I understand kind of the challenges that government have. I think one of the things that, you know, we like to talk about when we talk to our kind of public clients or government clients is that, like, so I'll use vaping as an example. We did some studies on vaping, and like there are certain values that are more present in people that than don't.
Right.
And so understanding like what is the behavior that you're actually looking to change. And if it's like a broader behavior, thinking about different ways of approaching it. So why does someone want to vote? There's different reasons. And so having messaging that resonates and is targeted to specific kind of value segments allows us to give different messages. Like you want to vote for your family, you want to vote for your community, you want to vote like
you want to vote because it's your duty.
It's your duty. Like but the duty message is not going to resonate with everyone. Right. Not everyone sees voting as a duty.
Right.
But some people different messages are going to kind of resonate. And I think within the kind of public space, what we try and encourage is like a bit more experimentation as well. Like try and use this and see, like do a test case to see A/B test, and like we see results when you just tweak the message a little bit more. The kind of click through on the call to action is
a little
kind of increased or different. And so I think it's just important to kind of think about why that happens, and within that or kind of within the public space, like how we can, instead of trying to do this broad messaging, think about things in a bit more of a targeted way.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Which generational segments are organizations asking about most? Are there generations and companies that maybe not thinking about as much? I think we get a lot of Gen Z,
Millennials. I think we have like nobody really asks about Gen X, but it's like a funny joke because it's like they're like the forgotten generation and everything. Boomers we get from time to time, but more because I think the whole conversation around aging and healthcare and that sort of thing. But we're the really hot topics these days are Gen Z. Everyone wants to talk to Gen Z, so if you want to do so in a more targeted way,
when it comes to targeting segments, what are advantages of a niche strategy over wide appealing approach? I think we live in a world right now where people almost have an expectation that you understand them as well as they understand themselves. And so it's almost like you need to be a bit more niche in the strategy, but you can have kind of multiple niches. But it's more about like not trying to do this broad messaging, because that broad messaging isn't going to necessarily resonate with everyone.
Or it gets diluted. And so something it might have the potential to resonate with a certain audience, but if it's so broad, you risk missing the mark and missing your target.
And I think one of the things also that I was saying earlier is that with niche messaging, just because you're going after a niche millennial segment doesn't mean that you can't go after a niche Gen Z or boomer segment at the same time.
Yeah.
And then how can we be mindful of biases when creating a strategy? So I think this is where this really kind of comes into play. And it's kind of at the crux of what we're trying to kind of educate and advocate for, is like we all come to the table with some biases. Like that's just natural human instinct. And it's easy to kind of take a bias in terms of what you think and apply it and think that that's how other people think. In the healthcare world, I see this all the time. People who work in healthcare often have like a high effort towards health, and they assume that everyone else has a high effort towards health or a value around high effort towards health, and they don't. And I think by ensuring that you're bringing in not just demographically when you're doing research, for example, district groups, but from a values perspective, bringing in diversity and thinking about how those values kind of come up against each other. Like, are they going to be good at challenging each other? Kind of what does that look like? And I think finding ways to kind of make sure that you're bringing in different perspectives, different values to the table so that you're not putting up those blinders.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Perfect. Well, if there are no more questions, we'll give it a couple minutes if there are, but we're going to put up on the screen the social values quiz. You'll find that on our website. Please go through it and try it out. Reach out to us on LinkedIn if you what you think about it, and then we can kind of go from there. How are new segments within a generation classified? Like, is beginning research on Gen Alpha what key factors should be considered to understand this cohort? Oh, that's a great question.
That's a great question. Yeah. So we would likely start with qualitative research with people in that segment to understand what's going on, what's your life context, how are things different. We do a lot of social value sensing. So while we have been measuring and tracking a large set of the same values over time, there's always a chance to add new things in. So we're always kind of open to seeing, do our values measure this, and do we need to add something new?
Yeah, and I think ensuring that you're bringing people, if you're trying to kind of understand nuances within the generation, that you're not like recruiting all Gen Alpha from Toronto.
Yes.
Right? Like we need to be thinking about like how life experiences influence values, and life experience looks very different in different places. Qualitative is kind of how we always start any of our kind of segmentations. But if we're doing that, we need to be thinking about, not just like kind of that we're bringing in diverse like life experience into the fold, so that we're not missing anything.
Yeah.
And also having a perspective like for Gen Alpha of the parents as well.
Yes.
Getting a sense of like, how are you parenting? What are those things? And then how does that result kind of in the generation? And I think Gen Alpha is still a little bit too young for us to kind of fully study, but I think we'll be over the next few years kind of looking at them a bit more closely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your time today. We're at time, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Michele or I are available. Otherwise, we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.